Hello everyone, it's an absolute delight to be here again. And when I was here last, as Samantha's just mentioned, I was in the recipient of questions. I was just trying to answer questions. Tonight I'm trying to pose some questions to Paul. So it is a classic case of poachers and gamekeepers, I suppose. I'm really thrilled at the opportunity to take part in this conversation with Paul. I've known Paul for very many years and been an admirer of his work for just as long. And I remember writing quite a long while ago, now in the 90s I suppose, a review of his terrific biography of Franco, in which I said somewhere in the review, any historian would be proud to have written such a book. And I think that's absolutely right, and they would be proud to have written some of the other books that Paul has composed, including, of course, the Spanish Holocaust, and now this fascinating and excellent book, as Samantha said, brilliantly written, on the last days of the Republic. But why has there been this sort of lifelong preoccupation with the Spanish Civil War? I don't know how many books you've written on it, but plenty anyway.
The short answer is I haven't a clue. My wife reckons it's because I support Everton, and therefore I have a thing about supporting losers. You know. No, actually, I mean, how it started was that I was, like you, an undergraduate in Oxford, which I think is a dreadful university, and where the history course was more dreadful than there are words to describe it. And so at the end of my time in Oxford, as an undergraduate, I hadn't really been able to study any of the things I was really interested in. You know, we were loaded down with constitutional history and so on. And I got this opportunity to do an MA at Reading, which was entirely about the interwar period, which was what I was interested in. And I'd written one essay in Oxford about the Spanish Civil War, and of course knew very little about it. And when I got to Reading, I was able to do a whole course on the Spanish Civil War taught by Hugh Thomas. And I just got absolutely hooked. And it was wonderful because having at Oxford been torn about what I should do a doctorate on, and there was nothing much I was really interested in, you get the Spanish Civil War, you get everything. You know, you get Stalin, Hitler, Mussolini, fascism, communism, Freemasonry, you know, it was the works. So, you know, I was almost immediately hooked. And quite quickly, I ran out of things to read in English, thought I'd better learn Spanish. Started off with a group of alcoholic Colombians in the bar, and then I went to Spain. And of course, the Spain of the late 60s was much nearer to the Spain of the Civil War than the Spain of today. And I was just completely bowled over. I loved everything about it, you know, the smells in the street. I was quite thin when I went to Spain, you know, the food, you know, everything about it. And, you know, since then, it's been a sort of, you know, I fell in love with it. It's been a stable marriage. I once, as the Spaniards say, put horns on Spain by a brief affair with Italy, but you know, I always end up going back to Spain.
Well, I can certainly sympathise with your notion of Everton as not exactly champion, but as a Manchester United fan, of course, I'm getting used to this notion of being supporting a loser. But is the Spanish Civil War now? I mean, now we are how long? 40 years after the end of Franco. Is it still divisive in Spain as an issue?
It is amazingly so. I mean, it's eased off a little because of the economic crisis. You know, people have, have other things to worry about, getting their kids to school, paying for food, and so on. But actually, I mean, really about the turn of the century, there was a big boom because finally the grandchildren of the victims started to campaign. They wanted to know where the bodies were buried and so on. You know, they were seeking closure. So there began, basically from the very late 90s, early 2000s, this thing called the movement for the recovery of historical memory, which was a huge movement, and branches everywhere. That's eased off a bit, but what is incredible is in the academic world, how vicious it is. I mean, the kind of academic debate that one's used to in England, where, you know, someone might write and say, well, you know, I've read what you've written, I don't really agree, I don't think you've read this, I don't think you've read that, you know, I think you're taking things out of context, you know, and that, but basically polite. In Spain, it's literally, and I'm talking in academic journals, you're a fat bastard and a liar. It's literally, I mean, the level of personal abuse is quite astonishing. And in the main, it comes from the supporters of Franco, whose line, I mean, I'm caricaturing a little, but the line is, there wasn't a repression, and anyway, the bastards deserved it.
Well, that's just what I was getting at in a way, because of course in Germany, anybody, least of all in academic profession, who claimed to be a supporter of Hitler or defender of Hitler or a friend of the Nazis would be ousted straight away. But that is evidently not the case in Spain. You can be still Francoist and have an academic job, and it's sort of respectable in a way.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the things I regularly find myself saying is, you know, I cite you and Richard Evans. I say when Ian Kershaw and Richard Evans give a lecture on, you know, the Third Reich, they don't have to start saying a health warning. You know, some of you may be upset because I'm going to speak ill of Hitler. You know, it's sort of axiomatic that you will. You know, you'll be critical of Hitler. Whereas even in Britain, you know, I mean, I remember doing an event at with a very distinguished Spanish historian, Ángel Viñas, and the two of us were doing a thing about the Franco regime. And there were a number of old duffers who were seriously miffed, you know, and it got quite hairy, you know. And of course in Spain, you tend not to get the rows in the lectures, because people go, you know, like you don't go to Manchester City, Francoists don't come to my lectures, you know. So it's very clearly demarcated.
Yeah. Real Madrid supporter, wasn't he?
Franco, yeah, he was a Real Madrid supporter.
But is this splendid book you've just written now, or has just come out in English, I think was first appeared in Spanish, did it not? I mean, this divisiveness, has that been manifested in reactions to your book as well in Spain?
No, it's odd, really. I mean, ever since Franco was the last book that I wrote that came out first in English, and that because of its success it was translated and so on. And ever since then, my Spanish publishers tend to sort of grab the man. It's a bit like, it's the nearest I'll ever come to being Charles Dickens. You know, the chapters get dragged off me almost before they're finished. And again, it's sort of clearly demarcated that what you tend, for instance, in the case of the Spanish Holocaust, there was something like 700 newspaper articles written about it. And almost all of them were favourable, because, and what's interesting about that is that there's a huge literature, Francoist literature, basically concentrating on the atrocities committed by the anarchists and so on. And there's a huge literature from the left, very divided. It's villages, you know, entire villages, entire towns, entire provinces about the repression. And one of the things that was unusual about my book, The Spanish Holocaust, was that I looked at both sides. And what tended to happen was that the left-wing criticisms, or reviews I should say, they thought it was wonderful what I had to say about the Francoist repression, and basically didn't really mention. But there were a few anarchists who said, you know, why blame the anarchists? They weren't the only ones, you know. And oddly, on the right, there was a sort of sense, we don't need Preston telling us what we already know about what swines they are on the left. So again, even in the critical response, it's, you know, it's totally demarcated.
Yeah. Well, let's turn to the book itself now, and the book centres around the actions of three individuals, doesn't it? Maybe you should just tell us who these three individuals are, and what the argument of the book is.
Well, basically, as it was fairly obvious, after the last sort of bid for success by the Spanish Republic was the Battle of the Ebro, which began in August end of July of 1938. Initially a fantastic success, an attempt to join up the two halves of Republican territory. And then, in fact, Franco, who would never ever admit to any territory at all being lost, poured in a huge number of troops with a view, to stopping this initiative, when in fact what he could have done is taken the opportunity to take Madrid or to take Barcelona, but he was determined not to let the Republic have this success, and also because he never missed any opportunity to physically annihilate as much as he could of the Republican forces. And what effectively guaranteed defeat for the Republic during the Battle of the Ebro was Munich, because until Munich, there was still the hope that Britain, which of course had been covertly supporting Franco all along, would wake up to the real threats. I mean, it's interesting if one looks at Winston Churchill throughout the Spanish Civil War. He starts off as a ferocious supporter of Franco. I'm an aristocrat. If I was Spanish, it would be my family that would be murdered. By the end, he's a supporter of the Republic, not because he's left-wing, but because he's saying the future of the British Empire requires that the Spanish Republic is not defeated. So, by the end of 1938, it's fairly obvious the Republic is defeated, and the Republican premier, the great war leader, if you like, he's the Churchill of the Spanish Republic, Juan Negrín. He is obsessed with how the war can come to an end in a way that saves as many people as possible. Because Franco has made it absolutely crystal clear that it is his intention to annihilate as many Republicans as possible. I mean, he issues various statements. There's a statement in November of in the United Press, to a United Press reporter in November of 1938, in which he says, "We have the names of 1 million people who will be executed." So what Negrín is interested in is trying to secure a negotiated peace. And so he argues in favour of resistance in the hope, of course, that the international context will change in such a way that maybe the British will change their mind, will realise that they should be supporting the Republic. So in a way, Juan Negrín is the hero of the book. He's the man he's trying desperately to stop a humanitarian tragedy. The other two major protagonists are somebody called Colonel Segismundo Casado, who is the head of the army in the central zone, and a philosophy professor called Julián Besteiro. Basically, an awful lot of writing about the Spanish Civil War has been influenced by the memoirs of Casado, which were published actually in 1939, probably with support from MI6, bizarrely, called The Last Days of Madrid, which are basically lies from beginning to end. And Casado is the man who masterminds a military coup against Negrín on the 4th of March of 1939, and claims that what he was trying to do was put an end to the slaughter to save people. As a result of his coup, hundreds of thousands of people die. He does nothing. I mean, all of the plans that Negrín had to organise evacuation and so on, Casado does none of this. And Besteiro is the man who has enormous moral prestige, and he effectively gives legitimacy to the Casado coup. As I said, Casado's book, which was altered a bit but reprinted by the Franco regime in the 1960s, gives this impression that he was this amazing hero, and he writes about himself and says, all I tried to do was to redeem Spain. I saved millions of lives and never got any thanks for it. And it's literally lies from beginning to end. So basically, I mean, there are a lot of people in the book, and I find in most of my books, even the ones that aren't ostensibly biographies, I end up writing about the people. So it sort of centres on these three characters. And Casado, I mean, you know, as a younger historian, I'd read Casado, I'd sort of taken it for granted. So I was completely bowled over by what I found in writing the book.
Well, let's come back to the question of your interest in personalities and so on in a few minutes. But just before then, I mean, it's this a hero and two villains then in a way in the book, but. The notion, wasn't Negrín actually hopelessly optimistic then? I mean, you said yourself a few minutes ago that with the Battle of the Ebro, by the end of 1938, the die was largely cast, really. The Republic was losing, had lost. Negrín had hoped maybe for the international situation with Munich. That had failed to come about. You can cite Winston Churchill in favour of Franco changing his mind, but of course, Churchill was still at this time in the political wilderness and therefore didn't really count for all that much. British politics were, I would have thought, unlikely to have been swayed even if the outcome of Munich had been different. But as it was, they were preparing for a war elsewhere, not to intervene in Spain. So, and actually we didn't make a rush to help the Poles out either in 1939. So maybe the chances that the Republic could have been saved by international events and by an outbreak of war, either in 38 or if they could have held out to as late as 39, were flawed from the first. At any rate, highly optimistic.
Well, that's true to an extent. I think part of it was the hope that if the international situation changed, that the Germans would be too busy doing other things to keep giving Franco the scale of help. So that might have changed Franco's mind. But I think the big thing was, what else are you going to do? Because whereas, say, in the case of Besteiro, for instance, believed, and that even after the end of the war, when he was in jail, he was writing to his wife saying, nothing's going to happen to us, you know, everybody, you know, Franco knows that, you know, we are pure and so on. And of course, he was tried. They were asking for a death sentence. Finally, he got life imprisonment. Died in appalling conditions in prison. So basically, the difference between between Negrín and Casado and Besteiro is that Negrín knew what to expect. I mean, he knew what a Franco victory meant, because everywhere that Franco conquered, you know, there was massive killing. And so I think his hope was, and it was a hope and maybe optimistic, but he knew that to surrender simply guaranteed, you know.
But would the outcome have been, I mean, these are all what ifs now, of course, but would the outcome have been vastly different if they had fought on? In other words, I suppose what I'm getting at is, if the Republican cause was lost by, say, Christmas 1938 on the Ebro, and we go on to the coup in March 1939, the coup then certainly opened the doors to Franco's vengeful actions, which would have come about anyway. How significant in the overall sense then was the coup? I mean, if the war was lost, and the revenge would have been just as great anyway.
Well, I mean, again, we're dealing with counterfactuals, which I know we have some medical men in the audience, and the historian's Hippocratic oath is not to deal in counterfactuals.
Well, you do so anyway, though, don't you, implicitly? So we have to consider that, yeah.
I think it was a question of Negrín thought that the longer they could hold out, the more time there was to be able to arrange evacuation. You know, he was working very hard to get deals with shipping companies and so on. And that, of course, all came to an end, because once, within a day of the Casado coup, Casado was trying to have him captured and shot. So, and Casado was claiming that he was going to do all this. Absolutely nothing I mean, literally nothing was done. So that the people who fled when Madrid fell to the Francoists, you know, they arrive at the coast and there's nothing. You know, there's people committing suicide on the dockside in Alicante because they know what to expect. So in a way, I mean, it's certainly not that Negrín thought that he could win. He knew that. It's a question, I think, that what he was trying to do was to get as many people out as possible, and that required time.
Just as a little aside then, I mean, you said we're dealing with counterfactuals, and you were effectively saying, well, historians shouldn't deal with counterfactuals. But isn't it actually implicit in this book, but also implicit in historians' work anyway, that we do deal with counterfactuals? In other words, to understand why something important happened, you have to at least to surmise as to what the alternative might have been. That's not presuming in this terms of virtual history of what would have happened if Hitler had fallen under the bus in 1932, then no Holocaust, no foundation of State of Israel, and so on and so forth. But nonetheless, the immediate issues have to be taken into account. What could have then been the case if such and such thing had not happened? Isn't that all the case here too?
I think it is. I mean, you know, in my book, Doves of War, which is a set of biographies of women who were whose lives were wrecked by the Spanish Civil War, the brother of one of them actually ran Hitler over in Munich. You know, it was not intentionally. You know, this funny little man with a moustache stepped off the pavement and he hit him. Unfortunately, the funny little man with the moustache wasn't hurt, but he was annoyed. But you know, so obviously that might have changed things.
Just sufficiently.
You know, if Chamberlain had continued as Prime Minister in 1940, you know, what might have happened? Of course, they are implicit. But you know, but they're implicit and they are silent. I don't think we go on about. I mean, we may make the odd comment, you know.
Yeah, implicit and silent, but nonetheless they're there, and therefore we have to address them. That's all I'm saying, really. And therefore, I mean, the notion. I always think that counterfactuals, then it means this type of elaborate what-if scenario, and then the number of variables begins to become so great that, of course, nothing is arguable any longer. Well, it's arguable, but it's just on no evidence whatsoever. But on the immediate thing, then it is important that we actually recognise that we're doing that, as well as just do it silently. As for the other things, of course, there have been some ridiculous books written on in terms of Hitler and the so-called under-the-bus theory, you know, that what would have happened if, and then you build up an entire trajectories of possible developments, but then the number of variables, as I said, are so great that it's just pointless. But come back to the other thing, though, that we've already alluded to now, which is your interest in individuals. And, of course, who isn't interested in individuals, especially important individuals in historical explanation. But in this particular instance, but in wider cases too, then, there are also then issues of how the individual fits into wider impersonal or structural development, isn't there? Is there a possibility that in this book you sell those other structural or impersonal determinants a bit short in your concentration on the actions of these three individuals?
Well, it's possible. I'm always open to any criticism. I mean, when I started out, if when I published my first book, which is called Coming of the Spanish Civil War, there'd been an event like this, and someone said, "What kind of historian are you?" I would have said, believing it to be true, I'm a social historian. You know, I would have thought I was a kind of vaguely Marxisant historian. I was interested in, you know, class issues and so on. And yet, if I go back and look at that book, it's interesting to me just how much the role of individuals, for instance, in the various segments of the Socialist Party in the run-up to the Civil War, is deeply divided. And you know, I came to the conclusion, I think, basically from then on, that the role of individuals is often underestimated. And actually, I think it's linked to what you were saying about counterfactuals, that usually it's something about an individual or a small group of individuals that opens up these questions. What would have happened if? I mean, one of the reasons why I think I'm particularly hostile to counterfactuals, I mean, something I always say to students, you know, think of any historical situation is a combination of a whole pile of factors. I mean, an almost infinite number of factors. Think of it as a goldfish bowl full of marbles. And if you say, what would have happened if X, then imagine what happens if you try to take the marble from the bottom of the goldfish bowl, all the others shift around. And it's one of the things that, I mean, the most common counterfactual that one reads, and it's in a lot of quite serious books about the Spanish Civil War, is, oh, if the Republic had won, it would have been like Poland in 1946, which is absolutely, you know, it's such tripe because it fails to take into account that in between Spain in 1939 and Poland in 1946, there'd been this thing called the Second World War. You know?
Well, that's the sort of thing I'm talking about with the multiplicity of variables, so it's a pointless exercise. But what I was understanding by a counterfactual in the way we've been talking about it was something much narrower than that, much narrower time scale, or some, that we implicitly pose an alternative in order to understand better what actually did take place. In my case, for example, to understand the significance of Hitler's seizure of power in 1933, you have at least implicitly to understand really how things could have been different if Hitler hadn't come to power. You don't have to go into that, let alone elaborate all that, but at least it's there in your mind. I'm not saying we should necessarily make that explicit in our writing, but we have to be aware that we are doing that at the same time, I think. I mean, I just wonder with these various, you know, the significance of the individuals that you're talking about at the end of the Civil War, when effectively the Civil War was lost, poses then the question which goes wider than these three individuals as to whether the Civil War was, the loss of the Civil War was, to use another word that historians avoid generally, inevitable, or at any rate, whether given the fact of non-intervention by the Western Democrats, which of course benefited Franco, given the fascist supplies of arms and so on, whether given all these factors and many others as well as the individual Franco and other individuals here on the Republican side, whether in fact these structural factors did not already determine that the Republic could hardly at the outset win the war, and once the African army had set foot on Spanish soil, basically not win it at all.
Yes, I mean, I certainly think that the Spanish Civil War was lost for the Republic by the 31st of August 1936, you know, because of the way the international situation was. And equally, in terms of was the war inevitable? No. I mean, one of and the trouble is, because of the multiplicity of factors, takes quite a takes a minute or so to explain. But in the spring of 1936, Spain had a president who wasn't very good, and there was a plot basically to get a very good prime minister. So they impeached the president, and they got this very good prime minister, Manuel Azaña, to become president, and the idea was to bring in a very strong socialist politician to be prime minister. And the idea was that between the two of them, they could put a stop to the burgeoning military conspiracy. And it all went wrong. So the very strong Prime Minister, Manuel Azaña, gets to be president, where suddenly seems to lose all interest in politics and becomes interested in renovating palaces and organising gardens and you know, opening museums and going to the opera and so on, all the things that the heads of state do. And the left wing of the Socialist Party basically stop Indalecio Prieto, the would-be Prime Minister, get very complicated thing. So what happens is that you then have a president who's not very interested in politics and an extremely weak Prime Minister, a man called Casares Quiroga, who ignores endless pieces of hard information that there's a military coup. So yes, that's an absolute case where one is thinking, you know, if only he had taken, there are times where, for instance, with Casares Quiroga, at one point the head of the Air Force, a man called Ignacio Hidalgo de Cisneros, comes to see him, and he says, do you realise that so-and-so, so-and-so, so-and-so are plotting? Something's got to be done. And he said, how dare you talk about this? These are honourable military men. Spanish military men would never behave like that. And you think, what a nincompoop.
Didn't they bring Mola, who was the sort of instigator of the early stage of the coup anyway, didn't they bring him from was he in the Canary Islands or somewhere, and they brought him back to Pamplona?
Franco was in the Canary Islands.
Where was Mola?
Mola was in Madrid, and I can't remember what his role was, but he was sent up at the point at which Azaña was Prime Minister and also Minister of War, when he was very, very aware that there was military conspiracy afoot, he had all of the prime suspects sent away from Madrid, which turned out to be a dreadful mistake. So Mola, who was
Pamplona,
he was sent to Pamplona, where it was assumed he wouldn't get on with the Carlists, who are the sort of extreme right in Spain, and actually they got on like a house on fire. So that was a problem. Franco was sent to the Canary Islands. They were sent all over the place, and it was a mistake. Sorry.
Why did they not arrest? I mean, when they got wind of this coup, as you say, it wasn't completely kept in the dark. Why didn't they take steps to arrest Mola and one or two others? I mean, was that not just a sign of the weakness, even before the Civil War started, of the Republican leadership?
I think that's true, yes. At no point, and if one reads, for instance, the absolutely voluminous diaries of Azaña, he hardly ever talks in those terms. He'll call people in as Minister of War and tell them that their behaviour isn't honourable, but it never goes any further than that. But again, one of the problems is the military intelligence service is riddled with people who are actually clandestinely involved in the conspiracy.
So have you been a betting person in Spain in 1935 or 36, you wouldn't have put too much money on the avoidance of civil war, would you? Given what was going on, especially after the elections.
As we keep moving the marbles around the goldfish bowl, it gets more and more complicated. At the point at which the Popular Front, of course, is this big left and liberal coalition that wins the elections of February 1936. And what wrecks it, and to me, a book that I've kind of got in my mind that I will do at some point if I live to do it, is actually will be called, Guilty Men. And the guilty man is actually the leader of the Socialist Party, Francisco Lara Caballero, who's an absolute idiot, who, when the Popular Front wins the elections, instead of having a government of the Popular Front, in other words, that relates to that electoral victory, comes up with this mad idea in which he says, now, the Republican element, that's to say the liberal middle class part of the coalition, let them take power, and they go as far as they can, they do whatever reforms that they can, and then when they've gone as far as they can, we'll have a totally socialist government, and if that should provoke a fascist reaction, we will smash it. And you think, oh, no. I mean, that is something that, again, part of me reacting to individuals, I probably get too involved, kind of sort of wanting to shriek at them across the keyboard,
I suppose my own approach has always been to see the structural determinants that allow in certain circumstances, especially extreme circumstances, allow individuals to play a disproportionate role. And I'm guessing that not guessing, but my assessment will be that in your work, you're not too far from that you actually do look at these structural explanations for the road to civil war and the course of the civil war, etc. But then, quite rightly, see the crucial role played by these individuals at very important junctures, not just Franco, but as you've been saying in this book now, these three individuals who are far less known here than Franco, but this is a superb introduction to their actions at the end of the Civil War. We should bring the proceedings to an end, and as I thank Paul for his splendid answers tonight and for taking part in this discussion, which I've thoroughly enjoyed as being able to, privileged to be part of this conversation. But just to say that when I got my copy of this book, this splendid book, The Last Days of the Republic, I read it in 2 days, I think, because it does read like a novel, and it's a terrific read, like all Paul's books. So I encourage you to read it for yourselves and judge it, and thank you very much for participating tonight, and thank you to Paul.
Well, thank you. If you knew the saga of what it took Ian to get here today, you realise just how very grateful I am.